Welcome back to the Chasing Happiness podcast, an honest podcast about finding happiness, what it really means, and the process of getting there. My name is Crystal, and today I'm going to have a wonderful conversation with Mr. J, who is a relationship coach and trauma practitioner. But before we get into what exactly that means and what exactly you do you want to introduce yourself to everyone who's listening?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Crystal. What an honor it is to be before you in your presence. And I thank you for giving me this time and platform. So I am many things, but among them is an intrapersonal relationship coach. So what I do is I help people, help them discover and really bond with the relationship they have with themselves, because obviously the relationship we have with ourselves, it sets the tone and standard for all other relationships around us. You know, if you hear people say all the time, why do I keep dating losers? Or why do I keep finding myself in these predicaments? And why this and why this? And I'm like, well, with all the love in my heart, I'm going to ask you, what's the common denominator, or who is the common denominator? So I've been doing that for a while. And then, long story short, I lost my father abruptly. And when I mean abruptly, I mean I was talking to him one day and 4 days later, he was being lowered into the ground 6 feet under. And so what happened was a few days after that, I woke up in the middle of the night, almost having a panic attack. Now, mind you, I've never had a panic attack. But anybody who's never experienced a panic attack, it literally feels like you're dying, you're having a heart attack. People would talk to me all the time about panic attacks. I'm like, yeah. It's not all that. Whoa, Lord have mercy. Be careful what you say when you open your mouth. Anyway, but when I woke up from this panic attack, I actually smelled smoke. I smelled smoke in the house, and I jumped out of bed and I'm running to the kitchen and I'm, trying to sniff this, where's the smoke come from? I have 2 young kids, and I can't find the smoke anywhere. And I'm like walking all over. Now, mind you, we have a 5,000 square feet house. I'm going all over trying to find the cause of this smoke. There was no smoke that I found. So finally I laid back in bed, and, Crystal, all of a sudden what came gushing back to me was we had a very, very major house fire when I was 6 years old that caused a lot of trauma. And I never dealt with that. I was smelling the smoke of when I was 6 years old because trauma was coming up in my body from losing my dad.
Wow.
This set me into a whirlwind of what is going on. And so I started looking into delving into all kinds of different traumas. And I came across this TED Talk with a Dr. Debbie Silver, and she talks about betrayal trauma. And boy, when something just hits you, it hits you, and you have a revelation. And I reached out to her and I said, your TED Talk was amazing and it hit so well with me. And she said, well, I actually founded a membership only community. Would you like to come in and, look around and maybe get some resources to help? And I said, absolutely. So I joined the community and got a tremendous amount of help from that community. In the meantime, she found out that I was already an existing coach. And she said, you've been doing a lot of great work. And I've seen that you're actually starting to help other people in the community. Would you want to go through the certification process to become a certified betrayal trauma practitioner? Coach, but because I have a psychology background, automatically qualifies you as a practitioner. But anyway, I said, absolutely. So I went through the grueling process of becoming and I say grueling because not only is it intense, but we're talking about during COVID when I have young kids at home that I'm also, while trying to work, trying to educate them and, deal with the stress and anxiety of COVID and stuff. So, but anyways, so that's really when a lot of my calls started transitioning. I'm still absolutely dealing with people's relationship with themselves. And actually, Crystal, even more so now, more so because betrayal trauma, a lot of times it's because we don't have boundaries. We're not enforcing our boundaries. We don't, all this other stuff does come back to our relationship with ourselves. Not to blame the person for being betrayed. I'll never blame the person for being betrayed. No way, shape, or form. But if you're riding down the highway with 3 of your tires at 35% air pressure and the other one's at 20, and you pop a tire, no, it's not your fault, but there is some responsibility in what lessons can I learn.
Right.
So I'll stop there because I can talk forever.
No, I love this. And I think it's so important because COVID especially, here in North America, because I can't speak outside of North America, but here in North America has been really stressful for people with the relationships we've been forced to be in sort of close contact with that we never were forced to be sort of in those 24 hours a day situations before. So I know lots of people who have ended relationships. I know lots of people who have started new relationships. There's this whole sort of gambit of everybody, but it's not very often, unless you're talking to someone who's doing the personal work specifically, it's not very often you hear people say, oh, well, during COVID, I worked on my personal relationship with me, which I think is something we should all be doing.
Yes. So you bring up a lot of good points. I say all the time, what COVID did was it put a 24-hour mirror in front of us. And unfortunately, and I hate to say this because I might offend some listeners, a lot of the reason depression went up is because a lot of people got to know their real self and they didn't like it. But they didn't necessarily have the resources of how to fix it. So anxiety, stress, depression skyrocketed. So COVID was like a mirror because you had to stay with yourself. You had to sit with the person you're living with. You had all this time to reflect on who you were. And what do we do when we reflect on ourselves? We don't like to. So we numb, we distract, we avoid with all things that are 9 times out of 10 unhealthy, whether that's putting on weight or, what have you. But absolutely, I think, we are so accustomed to our freedom, not only here in the States, but just freedom in general. And when all of a sudden our freedom is taken away, we feel like a caged, animal. So yeah, COVID did force ourselves to look in the mirror. And a lot of people's jobs changed, certainly. Like you said, relationships a lot of them have ended. But I like to think that the ones that are still together, they've done a lot of deep work to iron out a lot of these kinks. Now, there are some sad things about COVID, even off the subject, like, I was a school teacher before I was a coach for many years. And school is one of the ways where like abuse, neglect, and abandonment when it comes to kids, there's a checks and balance there. If my kids came to school, and oftentimes they did, not eating for 3 days or with bruises on them or, cornflakes that in their hair that they ate 6 days ago, that's a checks and balances. You can kind of look into that. Right. When kids are home and from abusive or toxic or dysfunctional homes, there's not a checks and balances there.
Yeah, that's such a huge thing. And I think it's so important for us to remember in general that those relationships, even between, a teacher and a student, they're important because they teach kids who are in situations like that they're not alone, that someone is paying attention, that they don't have to keep living that way because someone will intervene. I think COVID has absolutely taught us a lot of things. But not to get off on a tangent about COVID, I do want to ask you though, because for me personally, COVID has definitely been sort of a reflective point of what do I want? If I'm going to invest my time and my energy into building a relationship in some way with another human being who I may be quarantined with at some point, what do I really want and need from a relationship? And I don't think we're teaching people, one, how to ask that question, or two, that it's even okay to ask that question of yourself, because we live in this weird society that says like, date when you're young, get married, have babies, go to school, life will be perfect. And then we wake up one morning, well, some of us do, and go, that's not the life I want.
Okay, but now you just said a mouthful, and here's the deal. I think it's absolutely, and I'm working with a lot of couples right now, some that are getting over betrayal, some that are just engaged and they're looking for some premarital coaching. So I deal with couples on the gamut, on the spectrum of things. But here's what's interesting. You don't know what you don't know. So we're changing all the time. I tell people all the time, we're not only human beings, far more than that, we're human involvements. You're not the same Crystal today than you were 5 years ago. You're not going to be the same Crystal 5 years from now than you are today. You might not even know or recognize the new Crystal 5 years from now. But here's what's interesting. If you're with somebody, they have to constantly get to know the new Crystal and you them, which is why, couples constantly have to build these bridges towards, one another to keep connecting. But here's the deal. You might meet somebody when you're 20, get married and live with them for 50 years, be married. And now you're 70. well, you know what? You were living with probably 30 different people. They were all the same individual,
Right.
but they changed so much. So I do like, yes, ask the questions. Yes, do the deep dive. Yes, absolutely, without question. You want to make sure you don't wind up with a psychopath or a sociopath. But at the same token, so much of relationships evolve and you have to compromise and negotiate and sacrifice and invest and holy crap, forgive. I mean, I'm going on a 21-year marriage. That's not without a lot of headache and heartache, but I'm happy. I'm healthy. I'm wonderful. Hopefully nothing goes wrong. I don't foresee anything going wrong, but I don't know what I don't know.
Right.
So absolutely, we can do all those dotting I's, crossing T's, and you name it. But like I was talking to somebody the other day, and unfortunately, her marriage of 17 years is coming to an end. She said, I can't believe my husband's, a porn addict, and he cheated on me, and I guess I just chose the wrong person. I said, no. You were 20 when you were choosing this guy. You were using the tools, the resources, the knowledge you had at a 20-year-old. Plus, your husband was probably a completely different person, and he was back then. Life happened. So you can't say I chose the wrong person like that, like Maya Angelou says, you did what you did with the knowledge you had at that point. Now that you know better, you'll do better. But I want to let people know, nobody chooses the wrong person. You make decisions based on the resources you have at that time.
Well, and I think to just add on to that, because I 100% agree with you, I think we also learn the lessons that we need to learn based on those choices that we make, right? So like I'm in a place now personally where I don't look at anything as a regret. I don't look at anything as a bad choice. I simply look at it as that didn't work out. So what's the lesson I'm supposed to learn from this? How am I supposed to grow and adapt based on whatever the outcome of this was? And, I've sort of used that gauge in my intimate relationships as well as my family relationships, because let's face it, family relationships can be complicated and traumatic as well.
Often are, yeah.
And it's really been a great gauge for me because I've stopped beating myself up in that way that, you were just mentioning. Like, I've stopped saying, well, you made a bad choice. You did a thing. I did the best I could in the moment. And as I grew and as I changed, what I wanted grew and changed too. And that's okay as a human being.
It is. There's an old saying, there's no mistakes in life. There's just lessons to be learned. And absolutely. I mean, like I said, we grow and we do have lessons. I think, again, not to talk about boundaries so much, but I think that's something that so many people are missing is boundaries. So many, and boundaries, and I say it all the time, we don't have boundaries in our life. Boundaries are like religion. We don't take on religion to force others how to behave. We take on religion to force us a certain way to behave.
Right.
And boundaries are the same thing. So you need to have your own boundaries. You need to enforce your boundaries. And if somebody comes into your circle and disrespects your boundaries, then they get a consequence. That consequence could mean, you don't talk to them anymore. That consequence could mean you sit down and have a firm conversation with them. That consequence can mean whatever it is. But you and only you have your boundaries. And the people that disrespect our boundaries the most are ourselves. And what happens is because we do teach people how to treat ourselves, we are giving people permission. I'll give you a perfect example. I was on the phone with somebody a couple of weeks ago. This lady from California, she's in her 60s, and she said, Mr. J, I was, I'm in the dating world, and I have a rule: guys do not pick me up at my house. They meet me at the restaurant, and that's it. I have a rule. That's my boundary. She says, but can you tell me, I was on a date the other night with this guy, and at the end of the night, he gave me a kiss. Okay, that was fine. But then he just kept kissing me. He really kept kissing me. And I said, okay, we're good with kissing. But he was pretty insistent. I said, okay, well, and I kind of asked her some questions. Did you talk to him? Did you, where was his hands when he was kissing you? Was this a thing where it was, crossing a legal thing?
Right.
Anyways, as it unfolded, she told this guy before the date, she said, listen, you live 2 hours away. Why don't you, I'm going to make an exception. Why don't you pick me up at my house? We'll go to the restaurant. And I said, listen, I'm not saying all boundaries have to be strict and stringent, because that's not the case. There are some negotiables. There are some boundaries that are negotiable. I said, but when you told him that your boundary is nobody picks you up at your house, but then you diluted your boundary, you basically taught him that your boundaries are negotiable. So at the end of the night, when he's kissing you, you kind of told him, hey, my boundaries are negotiable. So you got to stick to your boundaries.
That is such a huge thing, because I think often in my personal experience, often when we create a boundary and we start to get a little bit of that pushback, we go, oh, okay, with certain people. And then that boundary falls a little bit with certain people. Oh my God, such a great thing for people listening, because it does happen. And you have to sort of reinforce it again.
Yeah. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying every single boundary needs to be concrete. There are some boundaries that are non-negotiable, but you just got to kind of up your reinforcement with your boundaries. Know your boundaries and reinforce them. Absolutely. And I think you got to be very careful if you're an HSP, a highly sensitive person, if you're somebody that has low self-esteem, because all of these things help you negotiate your boundaries. And your boundaries really shouldn't be negotiated.
Oh, that is such a big thing. I want to talk a little bit more about boundaries, because I think this is extremely important. And I think we are not teaching people even really, or at least it's my experience in this life, we're not teaching people even how to create them in relationships and be okay with setting them. So what advice would you give to people who are maybe just starting to create boundaries for themselves and they're not really sure, especially in, intimate relationships, family relationships, how to enforce them, how to make them when they haven't had them for maybe 30 years?
Yeah. So many times when somebody is talking to somebody and somebody like, I don't know what I think about my boyfriend, or I'm not sure about this girl or whatever. And somebody like, well, how do they make you feel? And that's a great question, but I think an even better question is, how do you feel about yourself when you're around this person?
Ooh.
That's number one. Number two, whatever components you don't like when you're around that person, that's what you have to ask yourself. What do I need to offset that? And I'm going to give you an example. My mother, who's still alive and very well could listen to this podcast, love her dearly. But there's not a visit to her where you're not going to get an insult, put down, something. So I had to start making some boundaries. The boundaries could be I stop talking to her. The boundaries are the minute she says something, I confront her, whatever. Well, as a little boy, I loved the original Linda Carter's Wonder Woman. I used to watch that show. Oh my gosh, that was my show. Wonder Woman, that was my show. And I don't know if you know this or not, but her bracelets were made out of feminum. That's one of the strongest metallic chemicals on the Amazonian island where she comes from.
Okay.
And so every time somebody would, fire a bullet at her, she'd go, shh, shh, and they would deflect. Well, it got to a point where every time I would be on my way to visit my mother's, I would mentally put on my bracelets.
Oh.
And the minute my mother's verbal attacks would come in, mentally, it'd be like, shh, shh. Block,
I love
block.
this visual.
And I'm telling you, I would leave my house feeling, yes, I am an Amazon, instead of feeling like crap with all the negativity that I let in my mind the whole hour I was there. So the first thing you have to ask yourself is, how do I feel about as you know, it's not only just intimate partners, it's bosses, it's coworkers, it's family, and family knows what buttons to press. They know us.
It's so true.
Unlike somebody else who might annoy us, they might not have done it intentionally. Family knows the buttons. So that's one thing. Ask yourself, how do I feel about myself? And then what do I need? It's almost like the same thing with emotional flooding or triggers. I don't, if you talk about triggers, like triggers after trauma, triggers after betrayal. So many people have triggers that literally, and I mean literally, can bring you to your knees in a fetal position, especially if it's soon after.
Sure.
You have to ask yourself, okay, because I always say triggers are here to inform us. They're not here to threaten us. But your body is telling you something. Your body is telling you, I need something that I'm not getting. So as uncomfortable as it is, you got to sit with yourself for a second. It's like, okay, I understand. I get it. Our amygdala, which is the emotional part of our brain. I call her Amy if I'm talking to a female. I call her Elmo if I'm talking to a male, because our amygdala is shaped like an almond. So I'll say Elmo.
Oh, okay.
Amy is there Amy is our best friend. She's our best friend. She's there to alert us if we got to go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, all those F's. So she's our best friend, but she's also our worst enemy. Because what happens after trauma is Amy loves to cycle it. Amy loves to, do you remember this? Do you remember this? Do you remember? No, she's our best friend because she's there to remind us, be careful. Don't get into that situation again. Guard yourself. She's our best friend, but she's relentless. So sometimes when you got to say, okay, Amy, I appreciate what you're doing. Chill out. And you got to confront the triggers and understand your triggers are there to inform you, not threaten you. The trauma's already passed. It's behind you. You're not in any danger anymore. What do you need? I'm feeling ugly right now. Okay, then what do you need? Do you need to tell yourself something? Do you need to go buy yourself something? Do you need to what do you need? I'm feeling alone. Do I need to pick up the phone and call somebody? Do I need to, so that's what you need to do when it comes to boundaries, triggers, whatever. Now this gets into more somatic work, and I don't really want to get into all that thing. It's a long conversation. And here's the other thing too, Crystal. Just like what we were talking about, COVID, a lot of people are uncomfortable with themselves or uncomfortable, all this stuff, because, we want to do what we usually do, which is numb, avoid, and distract. I'm going to do a quick thing. Do me a favor. Fold your arms right now. Okay. So your arms are folded, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Are you relatively comfortable for the most part? For the most part.
I suppose so.
Okay. Now fold them the other way.
Oh, that is definitely not as comfortable.
Okay. So you want to go back to the way that's comfortable, right? Okay, yes. You can stop now. That's the deal. We don't want to do things that are uncomfortable.
Right.
And dealing with our traumas and looking inward is not comfortable. We want to go back to what we're used to. And if what we're used to is whatever we do to numb, distract, and avoid, which are usually unhealthy, that's what we're going to go back to. That's what makes healing from trauma sometimes so difficult.
That is such a big piece of information for people, because I don't know necessarily about the United States because I'm Canadian, but I can say for certain here in Canada, one of the things that has definitely happened during COVID is there's been an increase in alcohol consumption. There's been an increase in CBD and pot consumption because those things are all legal here. The government has noticed an increase because they release stats on it every year. And so there is a whole slew of us who are numbing our pain, who are choosing to numb whatever is facing us. And, it's funny because we live in a society where we have access to healthcare. We have access to psychological counseling if we need it, all of those things. And yet we still make the choice not to face the pain, which is why I think it's really important for people to know that there are people like you out there who can help them through that process so that it's not quite so scary. So for people who are listening, if they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Oh, I have the easiest website, I think, in the world. It's mrjrelationshipcoach.com. Simple as that. But let me just say this. Even if people never want to have a session with me, never want to see me, whatever, I have a lot of free resources on my website. I upload every single day to my YouTube channel, which you can find on my website. Daily hacks on relationship, divorce, dating, being engaged, trauma, betrayal. So even if you never come to my website, again, mrjrelationshipcoach.com, just come and take advantage of the many free resources that I have.
That's amazing. And for everyone listening, I will post in the show notes, like I always do, the website, the links to all the social media, the YouTube, everything else, so that you can get in touch, you can follow, you can take advantage of those free resources. But Mr. J, before I let you go, I typically ask a few questions of everybody who comes on the podcast. Are you game to answer a couple questions?
Okay, let's do this.
Perfect. So the first question is, if you could go back in time and give yourself a piece of advice, what would it be?
Something, I was homeless when I was a preteen. I quit school in 6th grade. I would tell myself, you might not have a say in the beginning, but you have all the say in the end.
Such a great piece of advice. Wow. That's super powerful. For anyone who's listening, I think you should go back and you should listen to that again. I was literally, it's funny that that's the thing that you said, because I was literally just having a conversation with someone earlier this morning about how we don't necessarily get a say in all of the things that lead up to our adulthood, right? What forms us, what shapes us, our health, our living situation, all of those things. But at some point in everyone's life, they start to get that say and they can make those changes. So it's really important. The conversation we were having was like, don't judge people for where they are, because not everybody has that freedom, but you do eventually get there. So I love that that's sort of what your advice was, because it sort of fit with the conversation I was having this morning.
I think that's awesome. Yeah.
Okay. The next question is, what inspires you?
I think injustice inspires me. What I mean is, I think so many times we're judged on the outcome of things. If you bake brownies and I bake brownies, they might look the same and taste the same and whatever, but you might have had to struggle to go buy the eggs. You might have had to struggle because maybe you have a physical disability to mix the mixture. Maybe you have problems with dyslexia. You might not have read the ingredients, so you had to pray and cry and hope you put enough salt in it. So everybody's like, wow, these brownies are good. Good job, guys. So much more might have went into that. So there's injustice that inspires me. One of my mottos when I went into coaching was that I wanted to help the broke, the brokenhearted, and the broke down. And that's because when I needed help, when I was at my lowest, I couldn't afford help. I couldn't find help. So I made it my mission, and I've kept that goal. Now, I wanted to help the broke, the brokenhearted, and the broke down. So injustice inspires me.
Oh, that is such an amazing answer. I love that. The next question is, who would you love to have a conversation with, alive or dead, and why?
Man, I'll tell you something. So one of the, Lord have mercy, when I talk about releasing trauma, I talk about being attached to the story, because oftentimes what we do is we narrate, then we ruminate, and then we marinate. And so we really got to watch how we talk to ourselves. But, Viktor Frankl and Corrie ten Boom, people that were forced in the concentration camps, who've come out completely forgiving and loving and being joyful to their experience, to the guards who raped them. I would like to understand. I would talk to Corrie ten Boom or Viktor Frankl and say, how were you able to invite your prison guards to your inaugural speeches? Were you inviting them to your weddings? Were you forgiving them and praying with them? Where does that come from?
Those are people I'm going to have to add to my list now. I love asking this question of people because it typically gives me someone else who I've never even thought of to this is someone else I would have a conversation with, because we don't often, in my opinion, we don't often sit down and think, who are the people who are around me that I do physically have access to that I want to learn more about, that I would love to ask a certain question of, because we get so caught up in the world that we're living in and we just don't take the time to do that. And so many of our stories and our history is dying because we don't do that, because we come from generations that didn't ask those questions. So I love that was your answer. The last question is, what does happiness mean to you?
Happiness means integrity, I think. And integrity is a Latin word for integration. And what that means is, do you do the same thing behind closed doors when nobody's looking as you do when everybody's looking? And I mean politically, religiously, physically. Now, obviously, when we're in the privacy of our own homes, we do things that we wouldn't necessarily do in public.
Sure.
But integrity is doing good because it's good, not because it looks good.
That is such a huge thing. I love that you brought that up. Oh, this has been an amazing conversation, and I am happy to have you back on the podcast anytime, because I think Wonderful. Not only has this been valuable to people, but I've loved this conversation personally.
Amazing. I'm so glad, Crystal.
So before I let you go, is there anything else you want to talk to the viewers about?
I just want to say this is that, what happens sometimes when we go through trauma or betrayal, and listen, everybody listening has been through some type of trauma or betrayal, whether it's the little b or the big B or the little t or the big T trauma. But what happens is that after trauma or betrayal, we take on certain survival skills just to cope with that trauma or betrayal. And what happens if we don't address them and heal them, they eventually morph into our personalities. And then we take those personalities into relationships. And basically, that's not who you are. It's what you've become based on your experiences. So trauma will come out and show up somewhere, somehow. I'm talking to people right now who've been 40 years out of trauma, but they never dealt with it. And it's coming out in certain areas of their life. So it's always good to look, go find your trauma if you need to and deal with it. Why not? If not, it'll come out and if you don't get a hold of your trauma will get a hold of you.
Oh, yes. And typically at the most inopportune time.
Inopportune times.
It's so true. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been absolutely amazing.
Awesome. I appreciate your time, Crystal.
Thank you, everyone listening. If you have found this conversation helpful or you know someone who might find it helpful, please feel free to share it. I, of course, will post in the show notes all of the links so that you can get in touch. You can get those resources that are shared as well. And, I appreciate that you guys keep coming back to listen to the podcast week after week, because I get to have amazing conversations like this because you keep tuning in. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you guys have a great week, and we will chat with you next week. Bye for now.